The rain wouldn't stop. Sarah watched it streak down the windows as she counted her last $20. 14 truckers sat outside in the storm, their rigs dark and cold with nowhere to go. Her small cafe was barely holding on, just some old soup, stale crackers, and weak coffee that had been sitting too long. But when she saw those drivers shivering in the rain, Sarah unlocked the door without thinking twice. She gave them everything she had. No questions asked, no payment expected. 3 days later, the world would shake with what rolled up to her door. Welcome to Lucid Reliquary Stories. If you love stories that touch your heart, hit subscribe and let us bring more powerful moments to your life. The storm had swallowed the interstate. From behind the counter, Sarah could barely see past the glass doors. Rain hammered the roof of the old Sunrise Cafe like angry fists. The neon sign flickered and buzzed, casting strange shadows on the empty parking lot. She pulled her sweater tight and wiped the same spot on the counter for the 3rd time. Business was almost gone. It wasn't just tonight's storm, it was everything. The big truck plaza down the road, the fancy chain restaurants, the bills that kept coming, even when the customers didn't. The old clock above the register showed 8:30. Time to go home. Sarah reached for her keys, ready to lock up for another quiet night, when headlights cut through the darkness. A big rig pulled in, engines sputtering and smoking. The driver jumped out, rain soaking his jacket before he reached the door. He pushed inside, boots squeaking on the wet floor. "You still open?" he asked, water dripping from his cap. "My truck broke down. Been driving for 12 hours straight." Sarah looked at her empty shelves, the last pot of soup growing cold on the burner. Then she smiled. "Come on in and get warm." His name was Tom. Before she knew it, more trucks started pulling in. One by one, drivers stumbled through her door, tired and soaked from the storm. Sarah's heart sank. She had maybe enough food for 2 people, not a room full of hungry truckers. She glanced toward the kitchen where Danny, her teenage helper, was cleaning the grill with tired eyes. Her husband Robert sat in the corner booth, his walker folded beside him. The old flannel shirt hung loose on his thin frame. His eyes moved from the door to the growing crowd, and for just a moment, she saw a spark of the man he used to be. Sarah made a choice without saying a word. She nodded to Danny. "Use whatever we have," she said quietly. "Nobody goes hungry tonight." And so the cafe stayed open. Plates clinked, coffee brewed, the small space filled with the sound of boots stomping water off tired feet, low voices sharing stories like old friends. Robert pushed his walker forward, drawn into easy talk about roads and weather, names and tales flowing like they had years ago, when the world felt bigger and full of hope. For a few hours, nothing else mattered. Not the empty bank account, not the notice from the landlord. Inside these walls for tonight, they were alive. Sarah leaned against the coffee machine, watching rain run down the windows. Deep in her chest, something stirred. Questions she couldn't answer. Hope she was afraid to feel. She turned toward the storm, her fingers touching the worn door frame, and she wondered, could anything good come from a night like this? She didn't know yet. But 3 days from now, the ground would rumble with the answer. Before the wheels stopped turning, Robert Martinez was a legend on the road. He wasn't the fastest driver. He wasn't the flashiest rig. But when storms hit and roads got dangerous, Robert's calm voice on the radio pulled people through. "Take it slow, mile marker 97. I'm right behind you." That was Robert. The highway was his church, the big rig his home. And the endless miles held his life together like strong thread. Sarah loved him for that freedom, that connection to something bigger than small-town life. She loved hearing about sunsets over mountains, CB friends he knew only by voice, the quiet peace of early morning drives. They built their dreams between gas stops and way stations, a love story written in postcards and phone calls. Then one day, everything changed. Robert never talked about the accident. Ice on the bridge, truck too heavy for the curve. The life he knew disappeared in one terrible moment. When he woke up in the hospital, part of him was gone. Not just his legs. The man who sang along with the radio, who saw every mile as an adventure, he was gone too. Robert came home different, quieter. He sat by the window for hours, watching trucks pass on distant roads. His hands gripped his walker like he was still trying to steer through that final curve. And Sarah stayed. She cooked his meals. She helped him dress. She smiled through the kind of sadness that doesn't make noise. It just whispers every day, until even silence feels loud. Until one morning, Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee, set them on their small kitchen table, and said, "If the road won't take you anymore, maybe we can build something that brings the road to us." That afternoon, they signed papers for a rundown cafe just off the old highway. It smelled like grease and broken dreams. But to Sarah, it smelled like hope. Sunrise Cafe opened with no fanfare and even less money. But slowly, word spread. Truckers started stopping. Coffee steamed behind the counter. Stories traveled from table to table. Pictures covered the walls. Drivers in baseball caps, arms around each other, names carved into the wooden tables. Robert found a new rhythm, slower but real. He listened to conversations at the counter, helped fix CB radios, became a lighthouse for lost souls on the concrete ocean. It wasn't his old life, but it was still life. And it was enough. Until the world moved on. The new truck plaza opened 5 miles east, pulling traffic away like a strong current. Their parking lot, once full and noisy, grew quiet. Tables stayed empty. Coffee went cold in the pot. Robert returned to his window, watching, waiting for trucks that didn't come anymore. Sarah fought harder, smiled wider, hiding bills behind old menus nobody read. But some fights can't be won with hope alone. Some dreams just fade away, quiet as smoke through a crack in the wall. Now tonight, the storm outside clawed at the cafe windows. Inside, Robert sat silent, his fingers tracing patterns on the table. Sarah cleaned the same counter over and over, her heart heavier than any storm cloud. Young Danny stood by the kitchen door trying to stay busy, trying not to see the cracks growing around them. Hope hung in the air, not a bright flame anymore, just a tiny spark fighting against the dark. And still, Sarah wouldn't let it die. By 9 o'clock, the cafe was packed. Tables that had been empty for months now overflowed with wet jackets, muddy boots, and the low hum of tired voices trying to warm up. The old heater rattled in the corner, fighting the cold. Windows fogged up with every breath. Sarah moved between tables with Danny close behind, carrying plates of whatever food they could find. Soup made from almost nothing. Sandwiches from the last loaf of bread. The shelves in back emptied faster than the rain filled the gutters outside. They didn't care. They served what they had, laughing even when the bread ran out, and they started using hamburger buns for everything. Tom sat at the counter warming his hands around a cracked mug, telling stories that made the others smile. Robert watched from his corner booth at first, quiet, but as the night went on, as plates clinked and boots stomped and coffee flowed like life itself, something shifted. One of the drivers, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, looked across the room. "Hey," she said, pointing at Robert. "Aren't you Road King Roberto?" The room got quiet. Heads turned. Robert froze, surprised. The woman smiled, a warm laugh that melted the ice from the moment. "Yeah, you are. Robert Martinez, right? You talked me through that storm in Colorado back in '05. Thought I was done for till you helped me through." Voices rose around the room. Another driver spoke up. "You helped me too. That time in Nevada, black ice everywhere. Road King Roberto, that's what we called you." Robert, who hadn't talked to strangers in months, smiled. A real smile. the kind that made his whole face light up, the kind Sarah hadn't seen in forever. "You folks have better memories than I do," Robert said, his voice rough but warm. Laughter filled the room like sunshine. Stories spilled out, tales of breakdowns, blizzards, lonely nights, when Robert's steady voice had been the difference between making it home and never coming back. Sarah stood behind the counter, hand on the coffee pot, watching Robert come alive before her eyes. She didn't speak. Couldn't trust her voice. Instead, she poured another cup, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and let the magic fill the room. But the night wasn't finished testing them. A sudden bang shook the cafe. The heater coughed once, then died. Cold rushed in like a living thing. Tom was already moving, his boots sliding on the wet floor as he knelt by the old machine. "Give me a minute," he said, disappearing behind the counter. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, shivering not just from cold. The food was almost gone. What was left in the kitchen wouldn't feed half these people. She caught Danny's worried look and nodded once. Steady and sure, even though inside she felt like she was falling apart. 10 minutes later, Tom came back, covered in grease and dust, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Fixed it, best I could," he said with a tired smile. "She'll hold for now." Relief washed over Sarah like warm water. Not a victory, but a chance to keep going. Still, there was the food problem. When the last of the soup was gone, when the final sandwich was served, Sarah disappeared into the small apartment behind the cafe. She dug through her own kitchen with shaking hands. Cans of beans from her pantry, a bag of frozen vegetables, the roast she'd planned for Sunday dinner. She carried it all back without a word, just set it by the stove and got to work. The truckers noticed. None of them said anything, but their faces softened. Their voices grew quieter, more respectful. Some kindness you can't repay with money. You can only honor it with gratitude. That night, nobody left. They pushed tables together, made beds from jackets and seat cushions. Sarah found old blankets in the storage room and passed them around. Quiet laughter and soft conversation filled the air, mixing with the smell of strong coffee and wet leather. Tom found the old radio behind the register, tuned it to a station playing country music from years gone by. Robert rolled into the middle of it all, sharing stories, giving advice, smiling in a way that made the years disappear. At one point, a young driver, barely older than Danny, sat on the floor listening as Robert told about a mountain pass, a blizzard, and a truck held together by prayer and duct tape. And for a few precious hours, the storm outside might as well have been on another planet. The cafe, worn and weary as it was, had become a lighthouse again, a place where lost travelers could find each other and wait out the darkness together. Because on the road and in life, there are no strangers, only fellow travelers. And that night, the storm could rage all it wanted. Inside Sunrise Cafe, the light kept burning. 3 days after the storm, the cafe sat empty again. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that reflected the gray sky. Roads were clear now, trucks rolling down the new highway miles away. A steady hum that never reached their little corner anymore. Inside, Robert cleaned the counter in slow circles, a damp cloth moving across the worn wood. Sarah swept by the front door, her mind on bills she couldn't pay, on the eviction notice hidden in her desk drawer. The night of the storm felt like a dream now, something too beautiful to be real in the cold light of day. The coffee pot gurgled softly, the clock ticked, the world moved on. And then, a sound, low at first, like distant thunder on a clear day. Sarah stopped sweeping. Robert looked up from the counter. The rumble grew louder, closer, until it became the unmistakable sound of air brakes and diesel engines, of big wheels crunching over gravel. Sarah dropped the broom. Outside the windows, one truck appeared, then another, and another. Within minutes, the parking lot was full, a sea of shining rigs stretching down the side road like a parade of hope. The front door opened, And there stood Tom, still wearing his work jacket, a big grin on his weathered face. "Hope you got fresh coffee ready," he called across the empty cafe. Behind him, drivers poured out of their trucks. Some Sarah recognized from the storm night. Others were strangers, drawn by voices on the CB. Stories passed from driver to driver across 1,000 miles of highway. The cafe filled with boots and laughter and the sweet, overwhelming sound of life returning. Tom pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and set it on the counter in front of Sarah. "We pass the hat around," he said. "Truckers, dispatchers, even some companies pitched in when they heard what you did." Sarah stared at the envelope, heavy with hope she'd been afraid to dream of. "It's enough," Tom added, his voice gentle now. "Enough to pay the bills. Keep the doors open. Start fresh if you want to." Her hands shook as she took it. Before she could find words, another driver stepped forward, an older man with a gray beard and a CB radio in his hand. "This belongs to you," he said, setting the radio gently on the counter, old and scratched but still alive with memory. Robert reached out, fingers brushing the radio like it might vanish if he touched it wrong. "Had this since '98, the old man said. "You gave it to me when mine died in a storm. Figure it's time it came home." Robert's eyes filled with tears he'd held back for years. He nodded once, a small, fierce movement. Sarah, watching him, felt something break and heal at the same time. Tom slapped the counter with a laugh. "Words out?" he said. "Every driver from here to California knows about Sunrise Cafe now. You're stuck with us." Laughter broke out across the room, warm and wild. Danny peeked out from the kitchen, his mouth hanging open at the packed cafe. The eviction notice sat forgotten in the desk drawer. Inside, Robert turned the old CB radio over in his hands. Sarah watched the light return to his face, not all at once, but steady, like sunrise warming frozen ground. Hope wasn't a miracle. It wasn't magic. It was this. Broken voices finding their way back. Open doors in a world of closed ones. The stubborn belief that kindness still mattered. In Robert's eyes, Sarah saw it. The thing she'd almost forgotten how to hope for. Not just getting by. Living. Real, messy, beautiful living. And this time, they wouldn't face it alone. 1 year later, Sunrise Cafe was alive again. The parking lot overflowed with trucks from every corner of the country, their chrome shining under the bright morning sun. Inside, the cafe buzzed with life, boots stomping, coffee pouring, laughter bouncing off the old walls like it had never left. On the far wall, a framed picture hung proudly. "Heard this place is pretty special," a new driver said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Sarah chuckled softly. "First coffee's free," she said, "and there's always a story if you're staying long enough to hear one." Outside, trucks came and went. Inside, stories began again, woven together by shared roads, long nights, and second chances that nobody saw coming. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter, letting the sound of life wash over her. And in the golden hum of it all, she could feel Robert beside her, not as a memory but as part of the air itself. Still watching the door, still welcoming the road home, still here,